Admiral Cthera stalked through the pristine corridors of the Nexarian battleship Eternal Dawn, her silver-scaled tail lashing with barely contained fury. The crew scattered before her, pressing themselves against the metallic walls as she passed. Even after a decade of commanding the most powerful fleet in the Nexarian Empire, she still found satisfaction in their fear. Fear meant respect, and respect meant order. But today that carefully maintained order had been shattered by a single human. The detention level doors parted with a soft hiss, revealing a stark white chamber where Marcus Chen sat calmly at an interrogation table. He wore the charcoal gray uniform of the Earth Diplomatic Corps, somehow still pristine despite 3 days in custody. His presence here was an insult to everything Cthera had built. "Comfortable, human?" she asked, her translator rendering her sibilant speech into standard English. She towered over him, her 8-foot frame casting a shadow across the table. Marcus smiled. Not the nervous grin she was accustomed to seeing from prisoners, but a genuine expression that reached his dark eyes. "Quite comfortable, Admiral. Your hospitality has been remarkable, considering the circumstances." Cthera's facial ridges flared in annoyance. She had expected groveling, pleading, or at least signs of stress. Instead, he acted as though they were meeting for afternoon tea. She placed her clawed hands on the table, leaning forward until her face was inches from his. "Perhaps you fail to grasp your situation. You were caught in a restricted sector of Nexarian space. The standard penalty is death." "Ah, yes, Sector 87 Delta." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Though according to the Galactic Concordat of 2754, specifically Article 17, Paragraph 3, that sector is actually designated as a diplomatic transit corridor. I have the relevant documentation in my ship's computer, if you'd like to review it." Cthera's tail struck the floor with a crack that would have made most species jump. Marcus simply raised an eyebrow. "The fine print of ancient treaties doesn't concern me, human. What concerns me is why Earth's most decorated diplomat was found skulking through our territory." "Skulking?" Marcus chuckled. "Admiral, I was flying a clearly marked diplomatic vessel on a registered flight path. If anyone was skulking, it was the 3 Nexarian destroyers that were shadowing me with their identification transponders disabled." For the first time in years, Cthera felt her composure slip. How had he known about the destroyers? Their stealth systems were supposed to be undetectable. She reached out with her species' natural psychic abilities, attempting to probe his surface thoughts. The instant her mind touched his, she recoiled. Instead of the usual chaos of alien thoughts, she encountered something entirely different, a mind as orderly and serene as a perfectly tended garden. And at the center of that garden stood Marcus, smiling that infuriating smile. "The Nexarian ability to read minds is well documented," he said quietly, "as is the human capacity to adapt. Your people have been scanning our thoughts for decades, Admiral. Did you really think we wouldn't learn to manage our mental landscape?" Cthera fought down a surge of uncertainty. Everything about this human defied her expectations. "You still haven't answered my question. Why are you here?" Marcus's expression grew serious. "Because war is coming, Admiral Cthera. Not the border skirmishes and proxy conflicts we've been engaging in, but real war. Unless someone takes steps to prevent it. You expect me to believe Earth sent you here to prevent a war?" Cthera scoffed. "Your species has been pushing into our territory for years." "No," Marcus replied, standing slowly. Despite being nearly 2 feet shorter, he somehow managed to meet her gaze as an equal. "Earth didn't send me. I came because I've seen the intelligence reports from both sides. I've watched the misunderstandings and miscalculations pile up. And I've learned enough about your people to know that you, specifically, might be willing to listen." Cthera's ridged spines rippled in surprise. "Me? I am known as the most hawkish admiral in the fleet. I have advocated for preemptive strikes against Earth colonies." "Exactly." Marcus stepped around the table, his movements careful but unafraid. "You're a warrior, Admiral. You understand the cost of war better than the politicians and bureaucrats. And you're honest, Even your hostility is straightforward. That's why I arranged to be captured by your fleet specifically." The admission struck Thera like a physical blow. She had been manipulated, maneuvered into this confrontation by a creature she had been trained to consider inferior. Yet, instead of anger, she felt an unfamiliar emotion stirring: respect. "Assuming I believe you," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "what exactly do you propose?" "An exchange of information," Marcus replied. "I have evidence of certain factions within both our governments working to engineer a conflict. I suspect you have similar concerns about elements within the Nexarian military. Together, we might be able to." The ship's emergency sirens cut him off. Thera's communicator crackled to life with her executive officer's voice. "Admiral, 3 unidentified warships have just dropped out of hyperspace. They're charging weapons." Thera spun toward the door, then hesitated. Every instinct screamed against turning her back on a prisoner, but Marcus made no move to take advantage of her distraction. "Those would be the ships I was tracking before your fleet intercepted me," he said calmly. "Admiral, you have about 30 seconds to decide if you're willing to trust me, because I know their attack pattern, and your standard defensive formation won't be sufficient." She studied him for a long moment, her tail twitching as she weighed her options. Then she did something that would have shocked everyone who knew her reputation. She listened to her instincts instead of her training. "Come with me," she ordered, already striding toward the door. "But know this, human, if you're lying, I'll personally throw you out an airlock." Marcus fell into step beside her, somehow matching her longer stride. "Understood, Admiral. Though I should warn you, humans are remarkably good at surviving in vacuum. Just ask the Andromedans about the incident at Proxima Station." Despite herself, Cathera felt her mouth twitch in what might have been the beginning of a smile. As they rushed toward the bridge, she realized that for the first time in years, she had no idea what would happen next. And strangest of all, she wasn't entirely sure she minded. The bridge of the Eternal Dawn erupted in chaos as Cathera burst through the doors, Marcus close behind. Holographic displays showed 3 warships approaching in an attack formation she'd never encountered before. Their designs were unfamiliar, neither human nor Nexarian. "Status report," she barked, taking her position at the command platform. Her crew worked frantically at their stations, their scaled hands flying over control interfaces. "Unknown vessels are running with modified Nexarian signatures, but their energy patterns don't match our database," her tactical officer reported. "They're targeting our primary shield generators." Marcus stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. "Admiral, permission to speak freely?" Cathera's tail twitched with irritation, but she nodded. She hadn't brought him here to stay silent. "Those are Shadowclaw-class raiders," he said, pointing to specific features on the display. "Mercenary ships, built with stolen technology from both our species. They'll target your ventral shields first, then." The ship rocked as the first salvo hit. Thera's spines bristled as damage reports flooded in. The human had been exactly right. "How do we counter?" she demanded, swallowing her pride. "Their ships have a blind spot directly above their port nacelles. If you can position your destroyers here and here," Marcus's fingers traced paths on the tactical display, "while the Eternal Dawn makes a seeming retreat, you'll draw them into perfect firing positions." Thera studied the proposed maneuver. It went against traditional Nexarian battle doctrine, but there was an elegant simplicity to it. "Execute the human strategy," she ordered, "but be ready with standard defense pattern Delta if this fails." The bridge crew hesitated for just a moment before complying. Thera knew she'd have to address their doubts later, but right now she needed results. The battle unfolded exactly as Marcus had predicted. The raiders, expecting traditional Nexarian tactics, fell perfectly into the trap. Within minutes, 2 of the enemy ships were disabled, and the third fled into hyperspace. "Impressive," Cathera admitted grudgingly as the all-clear sounded, "though this doesn't prove your claims about a conspiracy." "No," Marcus agreed, but the data cores from those disabled ships might. Their crews as well, if you can capture them before their self-destruct sequences activate. Cthulhu was already moving. Security teams to boarding stations. I want those ships secured and their crews in custody immediately. Hours later, they stood in Cthulhu's private command center, reviewing the recovered data. The room was sparse by Nexarian standards, with only a large strategy table and a viewport showing the stellar expanse outside. These shipping manifests, Cthulhu said, her clawed finger tracing a line of data. They'd match intelligence reports about weapons being smuggled to separatist groups in both our territories. And the funding traces back to shell companies with connections to hardline factions in both governments, Marcus added. He looked tired but focused. Someone is arming both sides, Admiral. They're pushing us toward war while positioning themselves to profit from it. Cthulhu's tail lashed in fury. Cowards' tactics. If they want war, they should declare it openly. Not everyone shares your sense of honor. Marcus's voice held a note of admiration that made Cthulhu's scales ripple uncomfortably. But their methods give us an advantage. Conspiracies require secrecy. Expose them to light, and they wither. Cthulhu finished. She studied the human thoughtfully. You realize that investigating this will make us both targets. Some of these names, they belong to very powerful individuals. Marcus smiled that maddeningly calm smile. Worried about me, Admiral? Concerned about the diplomatic incident if you get yourself killed, she retorted, but without her usual bite. Besides, you're now the only other person who knows these attack patterns. It would be inefficient to lose that tactical knowledge. Of course, he said solemnly, though his eyes sparkled with amusement. Purely practical considerations. Before Cthulhu could respond, her communication panel chimed. The image of High Commander Virex appeared, her direct superior, and one of the most powerful military leaders in the Empire. Admiral Cthulhu, he said, his voice dripping with false concern. We received your report about the attack. Most disturbing. I'm dispatching a security detail to take custody of the human prisoner. Can't risk any further incidents. Cthulhu felt Marcus tense beside her. She knew what a security detail really meant in this context. The human would never reach a detention facility alive. My apologies, High Commander, she said smoothly, but the human is no longer a prisoner. Under Article 17 of the Galactic Concordat, he has been granted temporary diplomatic status pending investigation of the attack on an authorized diplomatic vessel. Virex's facial ridges darkened with anger. You dare cite regulations to me? This is a matter of imperial security. Indeed it is, Cthulhu replied, her own anger rising. Which is why I've already transmitted copies of the data we recovered to both the Imperial Archive and the Diplomatic Court. Standard procedure for incidents involving multiple jurisdictions, of course. The High Commander's image flickered as he struggled to maintain composure. You're playing a dangerous game, Cthulhu. No, sir. I'm following proper protocol. As always. She ended the transmission before he could respond. Marcus let out a low whistle. You realize you just painted a target on your back as well. I'm an Nexarian warrior, Cthulhu said firmly. We don't hide from threats. She turned to face him fully. But perhaps it would be wise to combine our resources. Temporarily, of course. For efficiency. Of course, Marcus agreed, his expression serious, though his eyes still held that hint of amusement. Purely practical considerations. Cthulhu found herself fighting back another almost smile. We'll need to move quickly. Virex won't waste time mounting another attempt. Then we better get started. Marcus moved to the strategy table, already pulling up new data streams. I hope you're ready for some very unorthodox tactics, Admiral. This won't be like any battle you've fought before. Looking at the human's confident posture and clever eyes, Cthulhu had a feeling he wasn't just talking about their investigation. Strangest of all, she found herself looking forward to whatever challenges lay ahead. The stars outside seemed to shine brighter as Predator and Diplomat began their dangerous dance, neither quite ready to admit that they might be stronger together than apart. The orbital station above Nexus Prime was supposed to be neutral territory. That illusion shattered as Cthera and Marcus rounded a corner to find three armed figures waiting for them. Cthera's combat instincts kicked in immediately, but Marcus moved faster, pulling her into a maintenance alcove as energy bolts scorched the wall behind them. "Those aren't standard military weapons," Cthera growled, her tail coiled tight with tension. The attacker's energy signatures were masked, technology that shouldn't exist outside of Black Ops units. "No, they're not." Marcus's voice was calm, but his eyes were alert as he assessed their situation. "Prototype phase rifles. I saw the designs and the data we recovered. They're not supposed to be in production for another 3 years." Another burst of energy fire forced them deeper into the alcove. Cthera's claws extended instinctively, but she knew they were at a disadvantage. Her sidearm wouldn't match the attacker's advanced weapons, and the station's layout gave them limited escape routes. "We're trapped," she hissed, frustration evident in her voice. She wasn't used to being the prey. Marcus gave her that infuriating half-smile. "Admiral, has anyone ever told you that you think too much like a warrior?" Before she could respond, he reached up and grabbed a maintenance panel above them, revealing a maze of service tunnels. Sometimes the best path forward isn't through the enemy. Cthera stared at him for a moment, then let out a sound that might have been a laugh. "Lead on, diplomat." They crawled through the station's maintenance system, Marcus navigating with surprising confidence. Cthera found herself studying him as they moved, the way he anticipated problems before they arose, how he remained focused despite the danger. It was unsettling how much she'd come to rely on those traits. "Your knowledge of maintenance tunnels is impressive for a diplomat," she observed as they emerged in a lower level of the station. "Let's just say Earth's diplomatic training is very thorough." Marcus checked their surroundings before helping her out of the tunnel. "Besides, I find knowing the back doors is often more useful than having the biggest guns." "Is that a criticism of Nexarian military doctrine?" Cthera asked, but there was no edge to her words. "An observation. Your people's strength is admirable, but sometimes—" He stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. Footsteps echoed from the corridor ahead. Cthera's ridged spines flattened as she recognized the sound of military-grade stealth boots. They were being herded. "This whole station's compromised." "Not quite everything." Marcus pulled out a small device and began tapping rapidly. "Remember those shipping manifests we found? This station processes most of the legitimate trade in this sector." "Which means—" The corridor lights suddenly dimmed, replaced by flashing emergency beacons. A computerized voice announced a containment breach in the cargo levels. Alarm klaxons blared as security doors began slamming shut throughout the station. "You hacked the station's systems." Cthera was impressed despite herself. "I simply suggested to the computer that some of those weapon shipments might be leaking radiation. The response is entirely automated." He grinned. "Shall we use the confusion to make our exit?" They moved quickly through the chaos, using the panicked evacuation to cover their movement. Cthera found herself watching Marcus with new eyes. She'd known humans were adaptable, but this level of tactical thinking matched anything she'd seen from her best officers. They were almost to the diplomatic docking ring when Cthera's enhanced hearing picked up the distinctive whine of charging weapons. Without thinking, she spun and tackled Marcus, her larger frame shielding him as energy bolts cut through the space where he'd been standing. "Your concern for my safety is touching," Marcus said from beneath her, his voice slightly strained, but still carrying that hint of amusement. "Purely practical," Cthera replied, rolling them both behind a support pillar. "You're still the only one who can decode those shipping manifests." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. The thought of him being hurt caused an uncomfortable tightness in her chest that had nothing to do with tactical considerations. "Of course," he said, and something in his tone made her scales flush with warmth. "Though perhaps we should focus on surviving first, then discuss your evolving diplomatic skills." Cthera's retort was cut off by another barrage of weapons fire. She risked a glance around the pillar, counting at least 6 attackers. They're blocking our path to both our ships. Then we'll have to improvise. Marcus pulled out his communicator, showing her a schematic of the station. There's a maintenance airlock 30 meters back. Emergency suits are stored nearby. Thera's eyes widened as she realized his plan. You want us to spacewalk around the station's exterior? That's insane, says the Admiral who just used herself as a living shield, he countered. Besides, I thought Nexarians enjoyed a challenge. Before she could respond, a new set of footsteps approached from another corridor. Thera's heart sank as she recognized the particular rhythm of Nexarian military boots. They were running out of options. Fine, she growled. But when this is over, we're going to discuss your definition of diplomatic solutions. They made it to the airlock just ahead of their pursuers. As they rushed to don emergency suits, Cathera couldn't help but notice how efficiently Marcus moved, helping her with her suit seals even as he secured his own. It was a level of consideration she wasn't used to receiving. Ready? He asked, his voice now coming through their suit communicators. Thera checked their weapons one last time. Remember what you said about humans being good in vacuum. I hope you weren't exaggerating. Admiral, he said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. I never exaggerate. I merely present facts in their most optimistic light. As the airlock cycled and the void of space beckoned, Thera realized she was actually looking forward to whatever crazy plan he had in mind. It was a disturbing thought, almost as disturbing as the way her heart beat faster when he looked at her with those clever eyes. The stars spread out before them, infinite and beautiful, as they prepared to take their first steps into vacuum. Whatever happened next, Thera knew one thing for certain. Her life had become far more interesting since this human entered it. The refugee settlement on Helios I wasn't where Cathera had expected to find answers. The dome-covered colony housed displaced beings from dozens of species, all seeking shelter from the growing tensions between Earth and the Nexarian Empire. As she followed Marcus through the crowded streets, her hood drawn to hide her distinctive features, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was seeing her empire's actions from a new perspective. Your discomfort is showing, Marcus said quietly, guiding her past a group of young Andromedans playing some sort of game with energy spheres. Your tail's twitching. Cathera forced her tail to still, annoyed that he'd noticed, more annoyed that he'd grown so adept at reading her body language. I'm not uncomfortable. I'm alert. There's a difference. Of course. That infuriating smile again. Just like you're not concerned about missing the High Command's emergency session, you're merely being thorough in your investigation. She shot him a glare, but there was no real heat in it. They both knew he was right. The summons from High Command had come just hours after their spacewalk escape from the station. Missing it was tantamount to treason, but the data they decoded had led them here, to this crowded settlement on the edge of civilized space. Our contact should be in the next sector, Marcus continued, checking the worn-looking datavat. An information broker who specializes in tracking military shipments. She claims to have proof of who's really behind the weapons transfers. They turned down a narrower street, the overhead dome casting strange shadows through its energy field. Thera noticed how the crowds parted subtly around them, not out of fear, as she was used to, but with a kind of quiet respect. They recognized Marcus, she realized. The human had connections everywhere. You've been here before, she said. It wasn't a question. Many times, these people have lost everything to political games and power plays. They tend to notice things others miss. He stopped outside a nondescript building. They also tend to be excellent judges of character. Before Cathera could respond, the door slid open to reveal a small office crowded with mismatched furniture and holographic displays. Behind a cluttered desk sat a Cyberian, her crystalline form refracting the dim light into rainbow patterns. Marcus Chen. The Cyberian's melodious voice filled the room. I didn't expect you to bring an Nexarian admiral to our meeting. Especially not this Nexarian admiral. Thera tensed, but Marcus placed a gentle hand on her arm. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through her scales. "Lyra is an old friend," he said. "She can be trusted." "Trust is a valuable commodity these days," Lyra said, her crystalline features shifting in what might have been amusement. "Speaking of which, you'll want to see this." The Cyberian activated a holographic display, showing a complex web of transactions and communications. At its center was a name that made Cthulhu's blood run cold: the Sacred Dawn Initiative. "Impossible," she breathed. "The initiative was disbanded decades ago." "Officially, yes." Lyra manipulated the display, revealing more connections. But some believed its mission was too important to abandon. The preservation of Nexarian genetic and cultural purity at any cost. Marcus studied the data intently. "They're working with human supremacist groups. Both sides want war, thinking it will eliminate what they see as alien corruption. And they're using legitimate military resources to do it," Cthulhu added, her voice tight with anger. "High Commander Virex, he's not just involved, he's leading the Nexarian side." "Which explains why he was so eager to have me eliminated," Marcus said. "We've been tracking his operation from the start without realizing it." Lyra's crystalline form dimmed slightly. "You should know. There's a standing kill order for both of you now. The initiative doesn't tolerate threats to their plans." As if to emphasize her warning, an explosion rocked the building. Cthulhu's combat training kicked in immediately as she identified the sound of breaching charges. They were under attack. "Vac exit," Lyra said calmly, already moving to conceal evidence of their meeting. "The tunnels will lead you to the settlement's secondary dome. Marcus knows the way." Cthulhu hesitated. "Your information has put you at risk. You should come with us." The Cyberian's features shifted in what was definitely amusement this time. My, Marcus, you've had quite an effect on her." Another explosion, closer this time. Marcus grabbed Cthulhu's hand, pulling her toward a hidden door. "Lyra has her own escape routes. We need to move." They plunged into darkness, Marcus leading them through a maze of maintenance tunnels. Cthulhu could hear the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them, but something else bothered her more: the way her hand still tingled where he'd grabbed it. "Your network of contacts is impressive," she said as they ran, partly to distract herself from that unsettling sensation. "Though your choice of allies is questionable," says the Nexarian admiral working with a human diplomat. He shot back, but she could hear the smile in his voice. "Sometimes the best allies are the ones who make us question our assumptions." They emerged into an empty storage bay, but Cthulhu's enhanced hearing picked up movement from multiple directions. They were surrounded. "Speaking of questioning assumptions," Marcus said, pulling her behind a stack of crates, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you." His expression was serious now, all traces of his usual amusement gone. "The reason I knew so much about Nexarian military protocols, about the initiative, I had help. From your sister." Cthulhu felt as if she'd been struck. "My sister is dead. She died in a border skirmish 5 years ago." "No," Marcus said softly. "She defected. She saw what the initiative was doing and tried to stop it. She's been working with an underground resistance movement, gathering evidence. She's the one who told me to find you." The sound of boots on metal grew closer. Cthulhu's mind raced, trying to process this revelation. Her sister, alive, working against the Empire. It challenged everything she believed about duty and loyalty. "Why tell me this now?" she demanded, though she already suspected the answer. "Because you need to know that everything you're feeling, all the doubts, the questions about what you've been taught to believe, others have felt them too, including those closest to you." His hand found hers again in the darkness. "And because where we're going next, you need to be sure about who you trust." The doors at both ends of the storage bay burst open, revealing armed figures in initiative combat armor. As Cthulhu readied herself for battle, she realized something that should have terrified her but instead filled her with a strange calm. She did trust Marcus. Completely. And that changed everything. "Ready to do something crazy?" he asked, pulling out what looked like a modified shield generator. Thera's spines rippled with what might have been anticipation. With you. Always. The storage bay erupted in chaos, but for the first time in her life, Thera knew she was exactly where she needed to be, even if it was breaking every protocol she'd ever learned. The grand chamber of the Nexarian High Command had never felt so oppressive. Thera stood before the assembled military leadership, her silver scales gleaming under the harsh lights. Marcus stood beside her, his presence both reassuring and dangerous. The evidence they'd gathered was displayed on the massive holographic screen behind them, proof of the Sacred Dawn Initiative's manipulation and Virex's treachery. These accusations are absurd, Virex snarled from his elevated position among the other commanders. This human has clearly corrupted Admiral Cathera's mind. She was once our finest officer. Now she spreads lies that threaten the very foundation of our empire. Cathera's tail remained perfectly still, a control she'd learned from Marcus. The evidence speaks for itself, High Commander, or should I say, Initiative Director. A murmur ran through the assembled officers. Virex's facial ridges darkened with rage. You dare. She dares because it's true. A new voice rang out from the chamber entrance. Thera's heart nearly stopped as a hooded figure stepped forward, lowering her hood to reveal familiar silver scales and amber eyes. And I have the final proof. Senna, Thera breathed, seeing her sister in the flesh for the first time in 5 years. She looked older, harder, but her eyes held the same fierce intelligence, Thera remembered. Hello, sister. Senna moved to join them, producing the data crystal. This contains communication logs between Virex and human supremacist groups, coordinating attacks on civilian targets, attacks meant to push both sides into war. Virex's composure finally cracked. Kill them. Kill them all. He slammed his hand down on a concealed control panel, and hidden doors throughout the chamber slid open. Armed figures in initiative combat armor poured in, weapons raised. What happened next would be talked about in Nexarian military academies for generations. Thera moved with the fluid grace of a lifetime of combat training, while Marcus demonstrated why Earth's diplomatic corps received extensive combat training. But it was how they moved together that was truly remarkable, each anticipating the other's actions, covering each other's weaknesses, turning the chamber into a deadly dance floor. Senna proved equally lethal, her years in the Resistance evident in how she handled herself. Between the three of them, they held off the initiative forces, while the loyal officers in the chamber recovered from their surprise and joined the fight. The vault. Marcus shouted over the chaos, gesturing toward Virex's escape route. He's heading for the weapon prototype. Thera remembered the classified reports, a device capable of triggering massive solar flares, powerful enough to devastate entire systems. Perfect for starting the war the initiative wanted. Go, Senna called out, dropping 2 more attackers. We'll handle things here. Thera glanced at Marcus, who gave her that familiar grin. Together, they sprinted after Virex, leaving the sounds of battle behind. The vault corridors were a maze of security checkpoints, but Virex's own authorization codes were still active, allowing them to follow his path. They caught up to him in the central vault chamber. The prototype was already humming with power, its target coordinates set for Earth's sun. It's fitting, Virex said, not turning around. The two of you, here at the end. The perfect example of why our races can never coexist. Look how she's been weakened by your influence, human. The great Admiral Cathera, reduced to a puppet of alien interests. You're wrong, Cathera said, her voice steady. I'm stronger now than I've ever been. Because I finally understand what real strength is. Virex spun, energy pistol raised. And what would that be? The courage to change. She met Marcus's eyes briefly. To trust. To admit that everything you believed might be wrong. Beautiful sentiments, Virex sneered. They'll make lovely final words. He fired, but Cathera was already moving. She'd seen the slight tension in his shoulder, the tell that preceded action. something she learned from Marcus's lessons in human body language. The shot went wide, and she closed the distance. The fight was brutal but brief. Virex was skilled, but his rage made him predictable. Farah had learned to move differently now, incorporating the fluid grace she'd observed in Marcus's fighting style. When Virex went down, it was with a look of utter disbelief on his face. Marcus was already at the weapon's controls, his fingers flying over the interface. It's done. The prototype's harmless now. He looked up at her, his eyes soft. You know what happens next will change everything. Cthera nodded. The evidence they'd gathered, Virex's attempted attack, it would reshape relations between their species. The old guard would resist, but change was coming. The question is, Marcus continued, stepping closer, what do you want to happen next? Cthera looked at him, really looked at him. This human who had challenged everything she believed, who had shown her a different kind of strength, who had helped her find a truth she hadn't known she was seeking. I want, she said slowly, to break one more protocol. She moved forward, closing the distance between them. For once, Marcus seemed genuinely surprised as she pulled him close. When their lips met, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The High Command will have a fit, she murmured when they finally parted. Let them. His hands were warm against her scales. I think we've proven we can handle whatever they throw at us. Alarms were still blaring, and they could hear the sounds of fighting echoing through the corridors. There would be challenges ahead, resistance from both sides, prejudices to overcome, a new path to forge between their peoples. But as Cthera stood there, holding this impossible human who had changed her life, she felt nothing but certainty. She was no longer just a warrior bound by duty and protocol. She had become something more, someone who could bridge worlds, who could show others that strength came in many forms. So, Marcus said, his eyes twinkling with that familiar mix of wisdom and mischief, ready for our next adventure. Cthera's tail curled around him possessively as she smiled. A real smile, full of promise and possibility. With you, always. And in that moment, as sirens wailed, and the future rushed to meet them, the fearsome Nexarian admiral and the clever human diplomat stood together, proof that sometimes the greatest victories come not from dominating others, but from learning to open your heart to change. The end.